Welcome back to Mrs. Kate's YouTube channel. In this lecture, we will be reviewing some important information about habitat loss in the Great Lakes ecosystem. As you watch, please fill in your guided notes on page 36 in your workbook. Remember, items in red go in the blanks. This is easy, but make sure you're paying attention during the lecture. You will receive a homework quiz during the next class to check how well you understood this material, so please pay attention. In class, we have been looking at understanding how humans interact with their environment, specifically the Great Lakes. So far, we have looked at two major problems, pollution and invasive species. First, let's review the problem of pollution. Too much algae was one problem, which was caused by laundry detergent that had a chemical in it called phosphorus. The phosphorus was causing algae to grow too quickly. There was so much algae that fish were choking on it. Drinking water smelled like rotting vegetation. It was gross. So the government passed some new laws, and laundry companies had to stop putting phosphorus in their detergents. As a result, the levels of algae returned to normal. Another problem was the use of DDT. DDT is a pesticide that farmers were using on their crops, but it was harming bald eagles as it passed through the food chain. Luckily, we saw that since the government banned DDT, the bald eagle populations were able to return to normal. Another problem was the pollution of toxic chemicals, specifically PCBs. These were causing harm to fish and people. Here you can see a picture of a fish with cancer in its mouth. This was caused by the toxic chemicals. But again, we see that good things are happening. Change is happening. The government banned the use of PCBs, and you can see on this graph how levels of PCBs dropped. They didn't reach zero, though. PCBs are still a problem in the Great Lakes. Finally, we saw that there are still some continuing challenges of pollution. One challenge is acid rain. Another challenge is runoff from toxic waste dumps. These are still problems that people need to solve if we want to protect the Great Lakes ecosystem. A second major issue that we looked at was invasive species. First, we defined the term invasive species. We said that an invasive species is a plant or animal that comes into an ecosystem from somewhere else and causes harm to that new ecosystem. Then we looked at a few examples. We saw how the zebra mussel, the sea lamprey, and the alewife fish were all causing problems for the Great Lakes ecosystem, and we talked about how people have tried to stop these harmful creatures. We also talked about the Asian carp, and we saw how it jumps around when motorboats drive past. Even though many of the problems of invasive species have gotten a lot better, Asian carp are still a problem. So what about the natural habitats in the Great Lakes region? Is there a problem with habitat loss? If so, what's causing this problem? First, after watching this lecture, you will be able to describe the impact of habitat loss on the Great Lakes ecosystem. This is your first learning objective. In other words, if habitats are being lost, what is the effect? Are plants and animals being hurt? Second, you will be able to describe how people solve the problems of habitat loss in the Great Lakes ecosystem. In our previous lectures, we saw how the government stepped in to create new laws that help solve these problems. Will they use the same strategy here? Or will they have to try a different strategy? You'll be able to answer these questions after watching this lecture. During our next class, you will be reviewing some evidence to determine what the Great Lakes are like today. In your groups, you will review 3 documents that look like this. You can see these are specific to habitat loss. Each one has a lot of information about habitat loss around the Great Lakes region. As you review the evidence, you'll be trying to answer the question, is habitat loss still a significant problem in the Great Lakes region? Remember, as a booster, you'll be trying to explain that the problem of habitat loss is getting better. As a doomer, you'll be trying to explain that there is still a significant problem with habitat loss. Before you begin your classwork, it will be helpful to have some additional information. But first, what is a habitat? Hopefully, this is a review from elementary school. A habitat is the natural environment in which a plant or an animal lives. There are a lot of different kinds of habitats: freshwater habitats, forest habitats, ocean habitats, desert habitats. Even people have habitats. In this lecture, we're going to talk about two different types of habitats in the Great Lakes region: forests and wetlands. Here, you can see a picture of the forests near the Great Lakes. Forests are home to a variety of different plants and animals. They also provide a lot of important resources for people. One thing they provide is wood for constructing homes and buildings, or for burning in your fireplace when it's cold in the winter. Trees in the forest provide oxygen, helping to keep the air clean. Here, you can see another picture. Forests like this provide recreation for people who live nearby. In the U.S., people love to go hiking in the forest near the Great Lakes. Wetlands are also a very important habitat to the Great Lakes region. Here, you can see a picture of a wetland. A wetland is an area where the soil is usually wet or covered with water for most of the year. Examples include bogs, swamps, and marshes. Please make sure you're writing this definition down in your workbook. And if I'm going too fast, please feel free to pause your video. The definition of a wetland is easy to remember. It is an area of the land that is wet. Here, look at this picture again. You can see how large parts of this area are covered with water. Wetlands offer important habitats for freshwater animals. They are also important for protecting people against storms. When it's raining very hard, a lot of the water can go into the wetlands. But if people have decided to fill the wetlands in and build houses on them, what do you think happens to their houses when there's a big storm? You've probably guessed it. In many cases, the homes will flood. So, if these forests and wetlands are habitats, what is habitat loss? Very simply, habitat loss is the destruction of natural habitats. It means that these forests and wetlands are being destroyed. They're being ruined. Habitat loss often threatens plants and animals who depend on the ecosystem for survival. So, what has caused habitat loss in the Great Lakes ecosystem? I want to highlight two main causes. First, one of the big problems that we've talked about already is the overgrowth of algae. In this photo, you can see algae along Lake Erie's shoreline. As the algae grew really thick, it made it impossible for fish and other creatures to live there. Luckily, this is something that people have been trying to fix. The second major cause of habitat loss in the Great Lakes ecosystem is increased land use by people. What do you see in this picture? I see the construction of new homes and hotels. As the population grows and people have bigger families, more people are looking for places to build homes. Often, trees get cut down to make space for these homes. And of course, people like to have nice views from their homes. They'll pay a lot of money for it. So often, the habitats that get destroyed are the ones located right along the shores of the Great Lakes. In this picture, you can see developments along the Ottawa River in Canada. Here, people want to live along the river so they can keep their boats there. This is great for people, but it's not so great for the habitats along the Ottawa River. Take a minute to look at this graph. What does this graph show us? You can pause this video if you'd like. Let's look for some information. First, the title of our graph says Population Growth in the Great Lakes Area. So we're looking at how our population is growing in this region. On the left-hand side, we can see that we're looking at the size of the population. It goes from 0 to 5 million to 10 million to 15 million. 15 million people! That's a lot of people living in one place. That's 3 times as many people who live in the Dammam-Khobar area. Down at the bottom, we can see the years labeled from 1900 to 1990. So we know that we're going to be looking at how the population is growing over time. Finally, in this key here, we can see different colors. Each line of the graph represents a different region of the Great Lakes. Pink is the region around Lake Michigan. Purple is the region around Lake Erie, and so on. You get the idea. So which lake regions have experienced the most population growth over this period of time? Take a minute and answer this question in your workbook. You can pause this video if you'd like. Now, which lake regions have experienced the least population growth over this period of time? Take a minute and answer this question in your workbook. Again, you can pause the video if you'd like. Now, I want to ask you a question. In general, is population growth good for natural habitats? What do you think? The answer, in general, is no. Population growth is not good for natural habitats. This is because most of the time, people are destroying habitats for one reason or another. They might be clearing land to build houses, or they might be cutting down trees to use as building materials. Sometimes they're filling in wetlands to use as farmland. It's true that some people work to protect the natural environment. But in general, people cause more harm to habitats than good. Let's look at this graph to understand what is happening to the land being used around Lake Michigan, where population is growing very fast. Take a minute to look at this graph. You can pause the video if you'd like. The title of our graph tells us that we're going to be looking at how land use in Michigan has changed over time. So over time, how have people used the land in Michigan in different ways, comparing 1978 to later in 2000? On the left-hand side, you can see the percent change in land use. Here we have some positive and negative numbers. Positive numbers that mean that more land is being used for this purpose. Negative numbers mean that less land is being used for this purpose. Again, we're comparing what things were like in 1978 with what things are like in 2000. Here we can see that the land used for urban areas, or cities, is increasing. That's not really a good thing for the Great Lakes habitats. More cities mean that more habitats are being destroyed. Since 1978, land use for agriculture, or farming, has decreased. This means less area is being used for farms. One good thing is that forests seem to be increasing. Here you can see that compared to 1978, the amount of land used for forests has increased by about 10%. That's good news for the Great Lakes ecosystem. But unfortunately, wetlands and open land has been reduced. This isn't a good thing for the Great Lakes ecosystem. So now let's answer this question. Based on the graph, describe the recent patterns in land use in Michigan. Take a minute and write the answer to this question in the margin of your workbook. To give yourself more time, you can pause the video if you'd like. So in general, we've seen that habitat loss is a continuing problem in the Great Lakes region. As you've read, people decided that habitat loss has to stop. The government took action so that habitat loss would not continue. One thing they did was to try and protect forests. Timber companies were told that they had to cut down trees in a more sustainable way. They couldn't cut them down all at once. They had to make sure that the trees could grow back and that the ecosystem would not be destroyed. Another strategy that they used was that timber companies also had to start replanting trees. For every tree they cut down, they had to plant another one. This is what has helped forests in the Great Lakes region make a comeback. The government also passed laws to protect wetlands. As you have read, they created nature preserves. They also taught landowners how to protect wetland areas. Also, in some areas, developers must now create new wetlands to replace what they have destroyed. So that concludes our lecture. Thank you for watching Mrs. Kate's YouTube channel and for doing your homework. This will make your next geography class much easier. If you have any questions, please write them down and bring them with you to class.